Welcome to Sewing with Nancy with your host, Nancy Zieman. This how-to videotape is being brought to you by PFAFF, the largest European producer of sewing machines. PFAFF sewing machines and sergers are simply the best. By Pellon, the first name in interfacing and craft material, and the first choice of home sewers for professional results. Pellon products by Freudenberg. By Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. By the McCall Pattern Company, the most fashionable name in contemporary home sewing patterns and publishers of McCall's Pattern Sewing Fashion magazine. And by Nancy's Notions catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and unique, hard-to-find sewing notions and supplies.
Thank you for joining me. This is the beginning of my series on suede, ultra fun to sew, working with synthetic suedes. Over the past 10, 11 years of producing Sewing with Nancy programs, I've had about 3 or 4 programs on working with suede, but this time I'm going to take a different approach, taking the fun aspect of working with suede, showing you that it's very easy to work with. Starting off with rectangles of synthetic squares. This suede is about 9 by 12. It looks like real suede, but it's washable, 100% polyester, and the edges don't ravel, making construction a breeze. I'll be showing you the lap construction idea as well as some conventional sewing projects. But to begin being comfortable with suede, I'm going to start off with some gift and accessory ideas, working with pillows, cases, some really fun projects that I think you'll feel that it's easy to work with. Then you can proceed to making a skirt or a vest. So in suede, ultra fun to sew, we'll start with the basics and then proceed with working with garments. When working with a new fabric, it's always great to start off with a small project. And this first gift idea or accent idea is perfect, the color block pillow. Our pillows were made with or from rectangles of suede fabric, about 4 of them to make one pillow, color blocking different combinations of colors together. It teaches you how to overlap the seams and work with the top stitching details, and I'd like to give you those details right now. Here's our actual suede rectangles. They were 9 by 12, and I'll give you the dimensions for the pillows in just a few minutes, but I'd like to talk first of all more about the nap of the fabric. This is a synthetic suede, and like suedes, it has a nap, like a velvet or corduroy. When you brush it, you'll have to brush it in either direction. You'll find that it's against the grain or with the grain. When working with garments, I'd like to have the nap running upward. Keep that in mind for your home decorating or accessory products, just so that the grain of the fabric runs in the same direction to get the same look. Definitely, if you want a contrast look, you could change the grain, but in this instance, we're going to have all the grain running smoothly. When cutting the scraps or the squares and rectangles of suede for your pillow project, here are the dimensions. You'll need 2 of them that are 4.5 by 8. And then 2 squares that are 4.5 inches square. Let's line these up so they look like a pillow. And then the center section is 4 by 12. And the booklet that accompanies today's program gives you all these dimensions. This is what you'll need for the face of the pillow. And then the 2 rectangles on the back for the pillow are 6 by 12. But right now we're going to worry about the front of the pillow. And overlapping the small rectangle onto the larger rectangle. Now pinning can be a chore when working with synthetic suedes. We're going to be having exposed seam allowances, so that's why I'm overlapping the edges. But notice that it's kind of difficult to pin, and you many times get a bubble like you see right here in the fabric because it is so dense. Rather than working with the traditional methods, if possible, I like to do the overlapping by marking on the fabric a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now usually we work with 5/8, but 1/2 inch works well in this instance because I'm going to overlap the small piece to the large piece, covering the 1/2 inch line. That will give me about a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then rather than pinning, use an alternative, either a glue stick, or in this instance I'm using a liquid type of pinning product. This temporarily holds it in place, and overlapping, giving it a little seal, and it holds it long enough for me to sew this. So I'm going to do this on both of my pieces, that overlapping the small rectangle to the large one, and now it's ready to sew. The stitching on synthetic suedes, when you're using the overlap technique, requires 2 rows of top stitching. And we can simply do this with a double needle. We've used the double needles in many different programs. I'm working with a 3.0 or 4.0 millimeter needles. The numbers refer to the distance between the needles. Insert that into your machine. It works on any machine that threads from the front to the back and is a zigzag machine, and have 2 threads threading through your machine and then separating between a thread to each needle as you get to the double needle. Simple setup. If you don't have a double needle, you're simply going to work with 2 rows of stitching. I'm going to find a place on my presser foot where I can guide the fabric, kind of use as a handy tool or handy guide, so that I have about 1/8 of an inch of fabric extended or between the stitching and the edge. So that I'm stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And when I'm done, it's a fast row of even stitching. I've used thread navy blue that's going to match the center section. You could use decorative thread if you'd like, but the rows are even. On the back side or underneath side, it will look like a zigzag stitch because the bobbin has to accompany both needles. Sew both side panels, attaching the 4-inch square to the 4.5 by 8-inch rectangle, and then work with the center section. On our finished pillow, I'm going to give you a quick recap of this. The center section is going to overlap on the side sections. So we would like to do the same type of marking, and off camera I've marked the second side with a seam allowance, a 1/2-inch seam allowance, then overlap the center section so it covers the 1/2-inch line. Overlapping it would give a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. For a project such as this, you don't have to have 5/8 of an inch seam allowances, but I'd like you to get accustomed to that, because if you're going to do garment sewing, that's what you'll be working with. If you want to economize on fabric, use just a 1/2 of an inch or less. So top stitch both panels together using the same treatment. Simple, very simple sewing. Now the back of the pillow has a zipper, and I'll show you the finished back zipper. I like to use a zipper that's a little longer. We're going to cut off the excess tails or the length of the zipper. This is a 14-inch zipper going in a 12-inch length. It's easier not to have to sew around this tab. We're not really pinning today when working with suedes. It's easier if you use some alternative method, and here's another way to go about it. Say about 15 years ago, I made my first synthetic suede garment, and I used what is here, an 1/8 of an inch wide basting tape. It's sticky on both sides. I've applied one side already to the very edge of the zipper, and then just peel off the protective covering. We'll give it one more try here. Peel it all the way down. I'd like to have this tape so that it is not in the way of the stitching, because I've found that if it's in the way of the stitching, sometimes it gums the needle. Now you can have the zipper exposed, which I prefer in this home deck project, or if you'd like, you could simply meet the fabric to the center of the zipper. The choice is yours. Here we're going to make the zipper exposed and finger press the fabric along the zipper. I have my machine set for the same double needle stitching. I'll finish doing my pressing, finger pressing here, and I'll sew very close to the edge of the fabric, avoiding sewing through the tape. Now, if you would happen to sew through the tape, it's really not going to matter that much. We're going to take it off if we can, but sometimes it's just a little bit too much, and it might, working with it extensively, could possibly gum the needle a little bit. So after we've done the stitching, clip it, and then remove the excess tape. Just peel it off from the wrong side, and then meet the back of the pillow to the front of the pillow, sew around the sides with right sides together, turn right side out, and you have a great looking project and a great looking pillow for your home. Another great beginner project for working with synthetic suedes is the ultimate book cover. Cover your favorite book with suede, add an applique, and it's an adjustable cover so that you can use it on other paperback books. I'll show you how you can get it to the correct size. This is a perfect project for suede because we have all the exposed edges of the suede all around the edge of the book cover. Measure from cover to cover, and then add 3 inches. So I'd have this about 13 inches long, or wide, excuse me. And the length, you'd measure the actual book cover underneath, but I added a 1/4 of an inch, just a little additional length, 7 inches for the length of this actual suede piece. So you have a rectangle of fabric, and then so that it's positioned on the book cover, you'll need some facings. And this facing idea will apply a little bit later when we're garment constructing. That is, I'm not going to cut the facing pieces to the identical size or the length of the book cover. I have them about 3 inches long, or wide, excuse me, and the length is just slightly longer than the actual book cover. It's easier to cut them identically after it has been stitched. And the back side, again, a little bit longer than needed. On the front piece, I've already stitched. Placing the facing across the top 1/8 of an inch from the edge, stitching 1/8 of an inch down, and then a very 1/8 of an inch again on the cut edge. On the back, we have one exception, leaving this free so that this can tuck and wrap through the book cover. Just stitching 1/8 of an inch across the top and across the bottom. Now you could cut the facings the same size, but I have found I'm not very good at cutting them identically. So in this instance, after stitching, then I simply trim, following my scissor line along the original cut line of the book cover. Now if you'd like to add an applique, that would be the next step. And adding the applique, I've used a simple design, cutting squares of fabric. Started off with a 3-inch square, a 2-inch square, and a 1 1/4 inch to get this design. Now notice I have some glue type product on the back. You can simply fuse this into place, but what I have used in this instance is a fusible glue that bonds fabrics together. It saves one step of pressing. You don't have to apply the webbing to the wrong side. Apply heat and moisture, and do cover your suede fabrics with a press cloth so that they are kept nice and fluffy. I shouldn't say fluffy, but still have their suede effect. And then you can simply add the fusible liquid to the outer piece, and I'm going to edge stitch all this into place, but this just positions it, and position it once more and press. And with minutes of sewing, you'll have a great book shelf, or as always, to give as a gift. For a great accessory, try this ultra simple belt using an applique of a leaf design in the front of it and a hook and loop closing in the back. I'll give you the details on it right now. This is a relatively simple design to make. It requires about 1/4 of a yard of suede fabric. Now one thing I didn't mention is that this is a very expensive fabric, between $40 and $50 a yard. That's where we're working with small pieces. You can work with 1/4 of a yard if you do not want to have seams, or 1/8 of a yard if you want to seam it. So I'll leave that option up to you. But you're going to need a belt that's 4 1/2 inches wide, and start off with a length of paper to make your pattern that's about 32 inches. I have this 4 1/2 by 32 inch piece of paper folded in half. Here would be my center front. Now I'd like to get the shaping of the belt. From the center, it's going to be your widest point, and then taper to a 2-inch marking about 9 inches from the fold. Here I have this 2-inch marking, and I've tapered it. And then the rest of the belt is 2 inches wide. Now if you'd like the belt a little longer, simply make the adjustment, but this 9-inch section from the fold is where you'd like it shaped. Now you can, as I mentioned, use 1/4 of a yard and just cut 2 layers the size that I have of this pattern. Or if you would like a seam at that 9-inch mark, cut the fabric and then you can stagger it on your 1/8 of a yard purchase of this fabric and put overlapping edges and edge stitch as we did earlier on the pillow. So that way you could economize a little bit on this. Remember, you're going to have 2 layers, one for the front side and one for the back, so it's double layer. They'll be edge stitched together with just by stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge. But the main thing I'd like to talk about now is the applique area. Now the appliques can be detachable or they can be fused into place. We've fused many appliques with synthetic suede on Sewing with Nancy programs in the past, so I'm going to mainly go over the detachable type, or the part that has some dimension to it. They stay down, but they're attached in this, only in the center. Because of the leaf design, we can simply just trace on the wrong side with a pen. And really a pen marking works quite well, just getting the design. Now, you don't have to worry about naps so much when working with appliques. In fact, sometimes I like to just put the appliques in different directions so that I do have a change of nap, just for an interest feature, and cut out along the lines. The edges will not ravel, so you can be rest assured that you can just simply place this applique wherever you'd like it on your belt. To follow the same design that we had earlier, take a little bit more time in determining the placement, but it goes quite quickly. The simple way of finishing this now is just to stitch at a determined area on the applique. And at the sewing machine, I'm stitching in the vein area of the leaf, just with a straight stitch, and you can go over the area if you'd like to make it more secure. On our finished belt, you'll see that we have some of the appliques that have dimension to it, and some of them near the end have been fused into place. If you'd like to fuse this down, use your favorite material for fusing, and I've used right here a paperback fusible web where I've outlined the design on the paper side, fused it to the garment, or the fabric I should say, and then started to cut out the design. And after cutting, then simply tear away the fabric, the paper backing, and position on your belt. Position the fusing side on the fabric and fuse down, just as if we've worked with many instances before. Cover with a pressed cloth and fuse. Then you simply can do the outline stitching if you'd like, or you can leave it alone because it will not ravel. And that's a great suede belt. Here's another perfect project when beginning with suede, and that's the Ultra Safe Curl and Go bag. Perfect for your curling iron, for traveling, or even going to and from work. When working with this bag, we're going to be working with a rectangle of suede fabric. That's 9 inches wide by 14 inches long, 9 by 14. And notice the lower corners are rounded, and I simply used a saucer to get the plate from a saucer to get these curved. Now on the inside, to make it safe, we have some Teflon fabric. And this Teflon fabric is cut almost the same size, but notice that I've trimmed about 1/4 of an inch away from the edges. Backing this, I have fleece. You can use traditional fleece, or this has a press-on fleece to give this some extra insulation. Along the top of this, I've trimmed away about 1/2 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, really there aren't any specific guidelines, so that you can press and stitch the hem so that this edge is a folded edge to enclose the raw edges of the inside fabric. This inside fabric obviously will protect your curling iron, and then the outside fabric is easy to keep clean. The pocket for the cord is made by a piece that is 4.5 inches wide and 9 inches long. And again, it has the same curve along the bottom as the shape of the curling bag. If you'd like to press under the hem, finger press it under, and edge stitch, or use a decorative stitch, which I've done on this sample, then you can place this on the lower edge, and notice it is on the right corner of the bag, and it's just simply attached with 1 row of stitching to begin with. Stitching through the center. We are always doing edge stitching in this program, stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the suede. It's not going to ravel, it's not going to wear, so you can be very close in your stitching. You might guess what the next step is, because as I said, this is a very simple project. We have the 3 layers, the fleece, the Teflon, and the suede, and then meet wrong sides together, sandwiching everything together. Earlier in this program, we talked about pins and how it's difficult. You certainly can do it, but difficult to pin through a lot of layers of synthetic suede, and especially with the fleece and the Teflon fabric involved in this carrying case, it gets a little bit difficult to pin together. I've either used paper clips in this instance or used hemming clips to put it together. You're not going to sew over either of them, but when you get to that point, then you're going to remove it. But this nicely holds all layers together. On the finished bag, I secured the stitches at the top, maybe bar tacking a little bit at this edge to hold it, because this is going to have the wear of the fabric, and then also at the very lower edge, and just edge stitch all the way around. I love this for travel. I'm sure many of you will find it very convenient, and I hope you'll try it. In this first program on suede, Ultra Fun to Sew, I worked with many different gift ideas, accessory projects, just to get the feel and the workings with Ultrasuede. That's a type of brand name of fabric that I worked with in these projects. When working with this belt, remember you can make the appliques either having a dimension to it, not being stitched down, or they can be fused down depending upon the look that you'd like. The fabric doesn't ravel, so it can be accomplished in either manner. When finishing this belt, for a fast closure, I used Velcro on the back, some hook and loop tape so that it could be adjustable. Notions play an important role when working with suedes, as well as when working with other sewing projects, and I used the Instapin to bond 2 layers of fabric together, rather than using pins, because pinning is difficult on synthetic suedes. When working with appliques to fuse it down, as I'm working with the book cover, I use the Liquifuse to save 1 step of pressing so I wouldn't flatten the nap of the suede. So these are just 2 items that may save you time when working with suedes. Thanks for joining me. This is the second program of my series entitled Suede, Ultra Fun to Sew, working with synthetic suedes. I'm going to be showing you some embellishment ideas and accessories. First of all, an embellishment on a top. This is called Crazy-Suede, really patchwork with suede fabrics. It's easy to do because the suede edges can be left raw. And basically, I'll be showing you just how to top stitch or edge stitch the suede pieces to a base fabric. I'll be giving you other ideas, including some accessories. When the last ones will be what I call suede elegance, making this handbag with specific sizes of suede, stitched with decorative embroidery thread and decorative stitches, but the design is very nice. I'll be giving you the pattern sizes and the shape sizes so you can make this handbag. It is made even simpler by working with synthetic suede because all these edges can be left raw. I think you'll enjoy working with suede. These are great projects to start with. I'll get set up at the machine right now. To make the embellishment of Crazy-Suede Piecing, you're going to have scraps of suede. And at my local fabric store, I was able to buy a bag of suede scraps. And this is just a few of the scraps that I'm going to be putting together and embellishing in the yoke area. Because we can work with the raw edges, keep those exposed, it's a really fast process. When making the top that you saw just a few minutes ago, it took me about an hour to applique or piece the front and another hour to piece the back. So it's really quite a fun process and really didn't take a lot of time. But you'll need a base fabric. From the yoke of my pattern, I've cut a base fabric, a tightly woven fabric. This will not show except on the inside. And then you may want to take a little time out and mark the seam allowances. This happened to have 5/8 of an inch seam allowances, so I've just marked with chalk the 5/8 of an inch mark, just to use as a guideline. You'll see why in a few minutes. When working with the suede scraps, I'm going to start off with the center. But I do not want a mirror image on either side so that they're identical. The idea is to have this uneven and asymmetrical. Basically, it's going to be a straight stitch. My machine is set up with a straight stitch, simple sewing, and just use these suede pieces and kind of overlap them. The reason I like the seam allowances marked on this fabric is so that if my suede piece is a little smaller than the actual width of the pattern or fabric, I know it's well within the stitching line, so it can be a little short. You may want to just kind of put things at an angle, at least that's what I found works well, so that it doesn't have to be symmetrical. So you're not trying to get things square and even, but purposely uneven, and start building your crazy work. Now, for those of you who have been quilting, you may have thought about doing a crazy patchwork for your quilt top. Well, this is kind of the same idea. We're working this time with suede. And just do some overlapping, some creative combining. You'll find out really there isn't a right or a wrong way to doing this. So let me do some more top stitching. Again, I'm top stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. And I'll be going back and stitching down the side of the red area, but just kind of play with these scraps of fabric. Now I'm going through quite a few layers of suede right now, about 3 or 4 in the overlap section. And I found on some machines it's difficult for the needle to penetrate through all those layers. This is dense fabric. It's very strong. So what you may want to do in this instance is purchase a stretch needle. Stretch needles are blue in color. They're just coated that way so that you can identify them. But the needle has a point that makes it easier to penetrate through the fabric, especially if you're going through a lot of layers, and it works out well for the synthetic suede. After you've patched your yoke with all the different layers, and I've just begun here, I have a long ways to go, before inserting it into the neckline, then I would go back on the wrong side, follow the edge of my base fabric and trim off the excess suede scraps. Save them, you may want to use them at another time. And then insert them into the garment. And here's another close-up of the top that I made. A simple black top, but with this embellishment of the Crazy-Suede, it certainly has a different look to it. Kind of a fun garment to wear. Ruth Ann Spiegelhoff, who is a pattern designer and a nice friend, sent me this top to show you the way she designed some patchwork with suede, using much larger pieces, not as small as I worked with, so you can see you can get many different ideas from this one concept of working with suede. I hope you'll give this a try. Here's an idea of working with the synthetic suede and weaving it. We call it ultra weave. This cosmetic case has a unique design on the front with various narrow strips of suede woven through the base fabric. It could be used on an accessory like this cosmetic case or on a yoke of a shirt. Here's how to go about it. You're going to cut the base fabric the size of the pattern, whether it's a yoke or in this case for the cosmetic bag it was 5 by 9. But you could make this really any size that you'd like. The most important part of making this is the marking. I'm going to mark on the wrong side. Now sometimes the suede fabric is so lovely it looks the same in the front and the back. You may think that, but it's a little bit richer, has a greater nap on the right side than on the wrong side. I've already started to mark a few lines on the back side, wrong side, using chalk and a ruler. You're going to be having vertical columns and horizontal rows. The columns are going to be 1 inch apart, and I've started to mark these with chalk. 1-inch columns using the ruler and a board, however you'd like to mark these so that you have accurate measurements. You do this across the width of your fabric. Again, we're on the wrong side. Then for the vertical rows, the marking is going to be different. I'm going to start about 1 inch from the top, but then from there on, mark with 1/2 inch lines. Not 1 inch, but 1/2 inch. These markings will give me the guiding for cutting the fabric. And you continue until your entire piece has been gridded. And allow a little bit for seam allowances on the sides if you'd like. Now for cutting, to cut the fabric, I'm going to work with a buttonhole cutter. Usually we use this for one purpose only, cutting open buttons and buttonholes. But in this instance, I'll work with a piece that's totally gridded. I'm going to mark openings for the weaving. Starting with the first column, cut about 1/8 of an inch on each side of the horizontal, on the vertical row. Now notice I have a cutting mat underneath. That's very important. Skip a row and then work with the next row, cutting 1/8 of an inch on either side of the column so that the opening is about, let me just make a little bit more open. The opening is 1/4 of an inch wide. And then skip a row and go down one more. You don't have to measure exactly, but just eyeball it so that you have 1/4 of an inch of a slit. You keep doing this all the way down the column until you've finished. Then when you go to the next column, instead of starting at the top row, alternate it by starting at the second row and cut. And I think you get the general idea. You're just making rows for weaving, and we're going to weave this fabric strip through horizontally. This entire piece has been totally cut with alternating rows. And I've also cut strips of suede in a different color, about 1/4 of an inch wide. And I'm using a double-eyed needle. It has a large eye in both ends. This rounded tip works better than having a traditional needle for weaving. And I'm going to weave this on the horizontal areas, just threading it through. I'm going to start at the upper left-hand corner, weaving it underneath the openings. Like when you're little, making pot holders or whatever you may have done, and thread this through. And thread all the rows from one direction and alternate it then by threading the other rows until it's completely woven. This idea was inspired by one of my staff members, Donna's pair of shoes. They were leather, it had woven sections in it. And this is how we got the idea of using synthetic suede in the same course. You can see how the suede pieces easily go through this area. Now, to prevent it from shifting, on the reverse side, on the wrong side, there's fusible interfacing holding this in place. Use a lightweight interfacing. In this instance, it was a knit interfacing just placed on the wrong side and pressed. And then this can be completed by putting it into the garment or into the accessory. In this bag, the seam allowances caught the strip's edges, and you can see it's quite fun to put together, and it's a nice embellishment with the suede technique. Our next technique working with synthetic suede is borrowed from ready-to-wear. I like to call it the Ultra Slit belt. It is a very easy belt to put together, about 20 minutes of cutting and sewing, and the look has a lot of fashion appeal. And here are the dimensions. Take your waist measurement, and to that measurement add 14 inches. That's going to be the length of the strip of fabric. The width is going to be 4 inches wide. Now, generally you can buy 1/8 of a yard if you have a waist measurement less than 31 inches. If your waist measurement is more than 31 inches, that's not a problem. Just buy 1/4 of a yard of fabric and piece the fabric together, placing a seam at the center back. So again, waist measurement plus 14 inches, and the width is 4 inches, only one piece that size. Now for pressing. This 4-inch wide piece has to be pressed in half, meeting wrong sides together, fold so that the cut edges are meeting, and cover with a press cloth. I really can't stress this enough. With suede, because of the great nap of the fabric, you have to use a lot of steam and a wonderful press cloth. Never ever put your iron directly on the right side of the fabric. It would be disastrous. You'd get a nice imprint of your iron on your belt. So make sure you use lots of steam and press. Great, so you do the whole entire length of the belt in this manner. And as we used in the earlier part of the program, if you would like to work with this to make it a little bit easier rather than using pins, you could use a liquid type of pin product and just put it down the edge to seal the edges together to make it easy for stitching. The shape of the corners of the belt is at the diagonal. And on this belt corner, you can see it's slightly tapered. Simply measure 1 inch from one of the edges, 1 inch and angle to the point. This has been trimmed off, obviously, but that's how both ends have been shaped. Measure 1 inch inward and taper to the other corner. The edge stitching is next, going around the entire belt, stitching 1/8 of an inch and then again 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now earlier when we were seaming products or seaming suede pieces, I used a double needle. That was because we couldn't see the wrong side of the fabric. You know, the double needle gives a zigzag look at the bottom side. Here we have to use a single needle and edge stitch 1/8 of an inch all the way around and then 1/4 of an inch around so that you have the same identical stitching on each side of the belt. As you can see, the stitching is already completed. Now we need to just to create the slits so the belt can be worn. Fold the belt in half and then fold the tape measure, end of the tape measure to your waist measurement. And place the fold of the tape measure next to the fold of the belt. And at the waist measurement markings, or end of the tape measure, is where you're going to place some marks on the belt. Because in this area, you're going to create the slits so that the belt can stay closed. Again, we're going to use a buttonhole cutter and block. And I'll pull it out. And place one slit, about 3/4 of an inch long, next at the waistline marking, and then place 2 slits about 1 inch or 3/4 of an inch apart on the other side. 1 slit on one side, 1 on the other. You need these 2 slits so that the belt can be woven in and out. And there in 20 minutes or less, you have a great accessory. Sewing is an art form, and like art, I like to name my sewing pieces, and this one I call Suede Elegance. It's a great evening bag, obviously made with synthetic suede strips, some decorative stitching, and the use of fusible interfacing makes it go together so simply, and here's how. You're going to cut two large rectangles of fusible interfacing. You cut them out of the same interfacing color. I have them contrasting for you to see. One is 9 inches wide, the larger one 9 by 21. We're going to work with that one second of all. The smaller one is 2 inches narrower, 2 inches shorter, so it's 7 by 19. Have the fusible side up. Cut strips of suede. You can put them on the cross grain. We're going to work on the diagonal. And first I'm going to start with a corner piece to get going. And generally I like to have the suede strips just a little bit longer than the actual interfacing. We can trim that as we go along. And place this until you get the correct design that you'd like. Keeping the width of the strips even, or so that it has a nice, elegant look. And keep building upon this. Now you can cover, after you do the entire thing, I'm going to do partial of it, cover it with a press cloth and baste into place. Just quickly press. Notice I'm not going to be pressing it very firmly. Then after getting it positioned in place, flip it over, go to the ironing board and steam press it so that the two fabrics adhere together. After you've done all the various pressing of this, then trim the edges so that they're all, again, 7 by 19. Notice how this is nice and even. At the sewing machine, you can do some decorative stitches. And here I'm stitching using a decorative thread, a metallic thread, a kind of a feather stitch, and straddling this presser foot between these strips of the suede, just sewing over the edge. Remember, the suede is butted together, so we're going to kind of connect the suedes at this point. It's not going to be bulky because the suede pieces are not overlapping. Now remember that larger piece of interfacing? We're going to work with that now. And place again the fabric on this with the fusible side up, centering this piece on the larger piece of interfacing. Then cut 1 inch or 1.5 inch strips, whatever you'd like, of the black or the border fabric, and do the same process, steam basting this into place, and then do the decorative stitching all the way around. We've used a little bit larger pieces of strips, but here we've used somewhat smaller pieces. I think this gives a more elegant look. This is just a little bit faster to show you. So you have the front piece already finished. We need a little Velcro or hook and loop tape in this area, and a hook side of the tape would be positioned about 2.5 inches down from the, let me get it on the right side, the 2.5 inches down from the top. Just place the hook side of the tape and top stitch that into place. The lining has a lot of details to it. You cut a heavy lining piece the same size as that large interfacing. You're going to be cutting it 9 by 21. Use a heavy weight of lining or a blouse weight fabric. Now the gusset pieces make it so simple to sew because we have the synthetic suede. These pieces are 2 inches wide by 12 inches long, and they're placed about 1/2 inch from one lower edge along the side seam. The hook side of the hook and loop tape is placed 2 inches down from the top or so and top stitched into place. And on this sample, you'll see that we have some belting that is going to be used as the strap. This is placed 9 inches down from the top, and the ends have been butted together and top stitched just by straight stitching over that square of suede that I have positioning it. So there's a lot of details, the gussets, the hook and loop tape, and the strap. Meet right sides together, meeting your decorative fabric, the face fabric, right sides on the lining piece, and sew all the way around the edges. Use your favorite methods for turning corners. Do leave an opening about 4 inches wide on one end so you can turn this right side out. And you have this great bag. Here we have the bag all ready to go, and the last step is to meet right sides together and simply sew the strips, the gusset strips. Just top stitch or edge stitch. And believe it or not, that's the finished result of the bag. When I bring the bag, I can show you the edge stitching. When I bring it right side out, it's finished, and you have an elegant looking bag that took maybe 2 hours to sew. I'd like to recap some of the accessories that I detailed today. First of all, the Ultra-Slit belt. The belt made with 4 inches of fabric that was folded in half. Remember to measure your waistline, add 14 inches to that measurement, and then add a slit at your waist mark, one slit on one side and a double slit on the other. Notice how one end of the belt goes between the double slit and the remaining slit has one opening passed through. And that's how it keeps nice and tight around your waistline, and of course it's adjustable. On the Suede Elegance handbag, the key to putting this together so quickly was this vast gusset area. And the gusset area was sewn by simply meeting right sides together and just edge stitching the gusset section. And when you turn this right side out and tuck the gusset in, your purse or handbag has a perfect closure, and you do the same on the other side. So these are just some fast ways of making accessories with suede. Thanks for joining me. This is the third program of my series entitled Suede, Ultra Fun to Sew, working with the synthetic types of suedes. In the first 2 programs of this series, I detailed working with quick gift and accessory ideas. You learned the techniques of working with suede. Now it's time to make a garment, and we're going to make a vest. Here's a close-up of the color block vest idea. Great looking with the rich jewel tones of the suede put together, but mainly what I want to point out is the construction detail. On the outer edges of the vest, the edges are raw. We met wrong sides together of the vest and the facings. I have some special techniques how to put this together, especially the changes of the pattern. That's what I'm going to do first. Change the pattern, trimming off seam allowances, making a few new facings, and then purchasing the fabric after we've made the pattern changes. You can get by with less fabric than the pattern envelope says because we'll be trimming away allowances. So now it's time for me to set up at the table. Join me over there. When making this vest, the first step is to change the pattern pieces, and actually it's the most time-consuming part of making a synthetic suede vest. I have made new pattern pieces for the facings, for the hemline area, armhole, and neck. There's some specialty treatments here, and I'd like to go over those right now. In the hem area, we're going to have it finished with a facing as opposed to having it finished with a lining piece. I'm going to meet the front facing to the garment or to the front pattern as if it were sewn, and notice the shape of the front facing. It butts or meets right to that facing area. There aren't any seam allowances allowed. It goes along the cut edge, and then the seam allowance is removed at the side. The corresponding seam at the back facing is also trimmed away, and this facing along the bottom is about 2 inches wide. I have cut 2 layers of fabric or tissue paper so that we can cut this pattern out on a single layer rather than folding the fabric in half. And you'll find that I have 2 layers of tissue on all of the areas of the facings. Now you may be wondering, Nancy, how are you going to put facings together without any seams? Well, for suede we have kind of a new treatment. We like to call it a kissed seam. As opposed to a butt seam, we thought that it would sound a little better. It is removing the seam allowances. On this sample, I've simply kissed the cut edges together, back the fabric with a strip of fusible interfacing, and zigzag or straight stitch the areas. It's very flat without bulk, and we don't have to worry about it causing a lot of bulk where the seam allowances of the garment meet. I think you'll enjoy that. So that same concept now has also gone through the armhole facings, front and back, the same size as the pattern minus the seam allowances at the side and shoulder. And likewise, at the neck facing, the same size as the pattern, only minus the seam allowance at the shoulder. So this is the concept of putting this together. The facings are the same size as the garment, 1.5 to 2 inches wide, and removing all of the side seams allowances. Now the front, that's where we're really going to do a lot of changing. Remove every seam allowance. Outer edge, armhole, neck, the whole works. And if you recall from the first part of the program where we made a color block pillow and overlapped the seam allowances on each other, one seam allowance was removed. And that's going to be, in this instance, the front piece. So I'm going to outline this. You'll do a slightly neater job at home, but I'm just tracing the pattern along the stitching line, not the cutting line. And with a ruler, then draw in the grain line. The front piece is going to be overlapped to the back. So in the back, we need to maintain some of these seam allowances. Here is my double pattern of the front with all the white, or excuse me, tissue color seam allowances showing through. Then on the back piece, it's slightly different. We have maintained the seam allowances at the side seam and way at top at the shoulder area so that the front can overlap to the back and be stitched in this area. Now, if you're wondering about this blue shading through, earlier when I showed you the color block vest, I said all these edges were raw. What we're going to do later on is when sewing the facing to the garment, the seam allowance of the facing is going to extend beyond the pattern, just like you see here. We're going to then edge stitch or top stitch the two together and then trim away this excess area. Over the years of working with suede, I found it so much easier to trim the lower area after stitching because it's difficult to cut two edges identically the same or identical. Because they're going to be outer edges, you'll find it much easier. Now, if your vest is color blocked, like the vest that we showed you earlier, obviously not all seam allowances would be removed. On this area in the patchwork section, we left one seam allowance so it could be overlapped. The vest I'm showing you right now for simple cutting is just going to be one solid piece of suede. And now it's time to do a test layout. When working with fabric that retails between $40 and $50 a yard, it really does pay to take time to do a test layout, as I'm doing right here. Working with fabric that's 45 inches wide and a check. A check gives you a special advantage. You'll see why in a minute. By the way, suede is 45 inches wide. That's why we have the test fabric that same width. First of all, place the large pattern pieces with a one-way layout, all the hems at the bottom and the neck edges at the top, and matching the grain line with the check or the plaid. So you want to make sure that the pieces are exactly on grain. Now remember, I'm using single layout, so I have doubles of the front, of the facings, everything. Make certain that the double pieces, like the vest front, you have a right front and a left front, not two right fronts. So you have to have a mirror image of all of the tissue papers so that you're not having two of the same pattern pieces. Roughly lay it out. Now with the facings, we're going to cheat just a little bit, or compromise. The suede does not have a lot of give or pull to it, and it's quite stable. With this in mind, facings can be canted up to a 45 degrees off grain. Why? To save yardage. Rather than putting this piece on the straighter grain, I'd have to move it way up here. I'm going to utilize this little cubbyhole area, canting it slightly off grain. I wouldn't recommend this for the main body pieces of anything, but for the facings, go ahead and do this little economizing step. Get everything placed so that you think you're utilizing the fabric to its greatest potential, and then check the yardage. And I'll just lay this down here. And I'm using a little over 35 inches, so I buy a yard of fabric, 36 inches. The pattern envelope asked me to buy a yard and a fourth. So with fabric at $40 a yard, I'd be saving $10 by using this test run. So it does pay to do this when working with expensive yardage. You may want to do this with non-suede fabrics as well. And then purchase your fabric. Determine the grain line or the nap of the fabric. We like to have the nap running upward, as we did in some of the other samples earlier in this series. So we have the nap, the smoothness running up. Place the large pattern pieces first of all on your fabric. We have 1 yard of suede, and position it just like I had it on the test run. Now, I'm not going to get everything pinned down for you right now, but I'd like to talk about the actual pinning concept. Suede is quite dense, and rather than working with traditional pins, I like to use the silk type pins, the finer denier pins. It's easier to pin through this dense fabric, and I like to pin in the seam allowances. Where there aren't seam allowances available, the front doesn't have any, use weights to weight down the pattern and fabric together. And then do the rest of the pinning. When cutting, what I like to do is use a very sharp scissors, take long strides, carefully cut out my pattern pieces. If you have a rotary cutter, board, and mat, slip the cutter or the mat underneath the fabric and cut around, very carefully cutting the edges. So you do a test run, lay it out with a one-way layout, double pattern pieces, and after you're cutting, it's time to talk about fusible interfacing. This vest pattern has many facings, obviously all around the edges and the front areas such as this, and generally we put fusible interfacing on a facing, on the wrong side of the facing. In this instance, on this very casual garment where there aren't any buttons or buttonholes, I think fusible interfacing is an option. But on the skirt that accompanies this outfit, the waistline is finished with a facing. We definitely need interfacing for support and stability in the inside of this area. So now it's a great time to talk about working with fusible interfacing. Regardless of the type of facing you're working with, whether it's on a vest or a skirt or a jacket, on the facings you're going to have that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance that will later be trimmed off of the facing. On this particular interfacing piece, I've trimmed away 3/4 of an inch of the interfacing. Now generally we trim away 1/2 of an inch or so, but 3/4 of an inch is needed right here. The reason, later on when I'll be doing the sewing, I'll be trimming away the 5/8 of an inch, leaving about 1/8 of an inch of the interfacing, or the interfacing from the very edge. This will prevent the interfacing, the black, from showing through on the right side of the fabric. Simple as that. When fusing into place, position as normal and cover with a damp press cloth. Now, press cloth is important with all interfacings, but I'm using even a heavier weight to prevent any scorching or flattening of the nap of the fabric. Use plenty of steam and press, counting 10 seconds or whatever the manufacturer's instructions recommend, and going down the length of the interfacing. So you're going to fuse all pieces that you think may need the interfacing. The main goal to keep in mind is just remove the interfacing 3/4 of an inch from the cut edge, from the outer edges, and fuse in place. Now I'd like to show you the 3 types of seams that I used when making this vest. First of all, the kissed seam of the facings, where the raw edges are met together or kissed together, and the main implement right here, or the main tool, is a strip of interfacing, 1-inch wide strip with a fusible side up, placing the facings wrong sides on the fusible strip so that the edges are kissing, and then place this underneath the presser foot. I'm using contrasting thread right now, but you're going to be using matching thread. I have my machine set for a serpentine or a multiple step zigzag, and start sewing so that this presser foot is kind of straddling the 2 cut edges, and lock the stitches at the start and beginning. And when you bring this up, you'll kind of see that I have contrasting thread, but you rarely or can barely see the seam. It's almost hidden by the stitches. Then trim off the excess interfacing. Press this as I did at fusing on the interfacing, and make this stitch on all the seams of the facings. The next thing I'm going to do is put in a double needle. Off camera, I inserted a double needle, and I'm working with stretch needles, both with a single and the double needle. It's easier to sew in this dense fabric with the stretch needle. You'll find less skip stitches. As before, I'm working with the 4.0 millimeter, the extra wide or the wider double needle. Now to do the overlap seam, this technique was used earlier in this series when working with the pillow with the color block sections. I've marked a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance on the back shoulder seam, the seam that allowed with the seam allowance, and then pin using the glue type of pinning technique or very fine silk pins, and overlap the front piece to the back, covering that 1/2 inch line. This will give me the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Kind of pin that into place, and make sure that you have an extra long thread tail, because later on you'll need to tie or secure those threads. Sew with a double needle so that your stitching, the first needle of stitching, is about 1/8 of an inch or so from the cut edge. And again, use matching thread. Then when cutting this, again leave yourself extra long thread tails. This gives a lovely balanced seam. If you do not have a double needle, of course, sew 2 rows of stitches that are parallel to each other. So the side seams and shoulder seams are stitched with this overlap technique. Tie the threads to the wrong side, eliminate the extra thread tails, and a lot of your vest has already been sewn. Now for the facings. After the facings have all been kissed together, the seams have been met, and the seams of the vest have been put together, then meet the facing to the garment, wrong sides together. Here we have a vest ready to go with big clips, as you can see. The important part right now is working with this extra 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. The seam was left on the facing pieces. I marked a 5/8 of an inch mark, a real faint mark, in case some of this would show through later, and meet the vest front to that 5/8 of an inch edge. In other words, you want to have this 5/8 of an inch extended and pin all the way around the outer edges. You can use silk pins, possibly the type of liquid glue. We've used some hemline clips. You could use paper clips. I just like an alternative to traditional pins because it's hard to pin. Now, on a smaller sample, I'd like to show you the stitching technique. Again, working with 2 rows of straight stitching. In this instance, we're still going to keep the twin or double needle in place. It will be easier on this little flat seam for me to show you. And again, I'm just going to sew as I had with the overlap seam, sewing along the edge so that I have about, let's say 1/8 of an inch from the stitching line to the cut edge. And you'll be sewing traditionally in the round because the facing is finished in the round with a armhole or around the neck edge. Then for the trimming, this is the whole reason of leaving this extra 5/8 of an inch, because it's difficult to trim 2 layers identically the same size. Guide the scissors along the outer edge, and you'll get such a sharp, crisp edge for the facing. It will not be jagged. All edges will be the same size. And just cut. Yes, you're losing a little fabric or wasting fabric, but I have found of years of sewing with this, it's so much easier to put together. And these are the 3 basic seaming ideas when working with synthetic suede. This jacket combines traditional sewing and the new exposed seaming of suede. The side seams set in sleeve and underarm seam of the sleeve were conventionally sewn, in other words, with right sides together. But the outer edges have the new exposed edges technique that we went through earlier. Sometimes it's nice to combine these 2 types of techniques on a jacket or a more tailored garment. And I'd like to give you some hints about working with the seaming, the traditional seaming. Suede is a nap fabric. And when nap fabrics are met right sides together, sometimes the nap works against itself and the top layer tends to grow longer than the bottom layer when seaming. You can prevent that by frequent pinning using silk pins. Remember, we have seam allowances here, so we can use pins. And the other alternative is to use kind of an even feed mechanism on your machine. Now, my machine already has one attached, a dual feed area. It's already attached to my machine. Make sure that that's engaged. If you do not have a dual feed on your machine, there are certainly other alternatives. And a roller foot is one of the alternatives, with a roller that helps feed that top layer more smoothly, or you may have a walking foot in your accessory box. Try one of these 2 feet. You're going to be using, again, a stretch needle and traditional 5/8 of an inch seaming, and it sews quite quickly. And then when pressing, you'll find some kind of new techniques that you may want to incorporate or use when pressing the seam open. The fabric is very stiff, and when pressing this open, many times you'll have to use a press cloth and another technique. Traditionally, if you finger press a seam, it stays down. Notice this has a lot of spring in it. There's no way that that seam is going to stay where you'd like it. So in addition to covering it with a press cloth and using lots of steam, after filling this area with steam, then use a clapper and pound out the steam. You may have to do this twice, pressing the seam and going through this setup to make certain that this lies flat. You can see here it's not really cooperating just right. I'd have to do it again. This is the difficulty of the traditional seaming, but if you're aware of this, then perhaps you can choose a pattern with simple lines. On the jacket, just as a quick review, we had exposed edges along the very outside, and then in the jacket at the inner part, the sleeves, the side seams, and the underarm seams were conventionally sewn. So we combined the best of both worlds, a tailored look for the inside and the exposed look, simple look for the outside. This is going to wrap up my three-part series on suede, ultra fun to sew. Just as a quick review, I'd like to show you the specialty seams for suede. The kiss seam on the facings, where I met or butted the two raw edges together over a strip of fusible interfacing and then zigzagged, multiple stitched, or just straight stitched to the fusible interfacing. Then pressed the interfacing down, giving it a very flat facing seam. On the garment, for the overlap seams, overlap front to back and double stitch, either with a double needle or 2 rows of stitching. For the exposed seaming, the facing is placed wrong sides together to the garment with 5/8 of an inch of the seam allowance expanding, so that after stitching you can trim right next to the original cut edge of the vest and give a very sharp look. Try these 3 types of seams ideas when you make a vest, a skirt, or a quick jacket with working with synthetic suede. I hope you'll enjoy it. Bye for now.
This how-to videotape has been brought to you in part by PFAFF, simply the best European line of sewing machines. By Pellon, quality products by Freudenberg. By Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears. By the McCall Pattern Company, the most fashionable name in contemporary home sewing patterns. And by Nancy's Notions Sewing Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.